Thank you for coming today. It's an absolute privilege and an honor to be able to speak to you with respect to the Goodman collection. As Bonnie says, I met the Goodmans back in 1998, and over the decades was slightly helpful with respect to advising them with their acquisitions over the years. If you have not gone to see the exhibition, I urge you to run, not walk, over there, because despite the fact that I've known the collection for over the years, it's really awe-inspiring to see such an encyclopedic collection hanging in one great exhibition hall. I was telling Bonnie earlier that there are many museums, public institutions, not just university museums, which do not have the breadth and depth of the Goodman collection in their Latin American holdings. It's really, truly the envy of not only the state of Florida, forget Fort Lauderdale, but the United States. And I'm not making this statement lightly, so I really do encourage you to go check out the exhibition if you haven't done so already. Given the fact that there are close to 100 works of art in the collection, it would be a disservice to the collection to try to give you, a quick run through of the collection. That would take. You could actually do 100 lectures over the contents of this collection. So what I've done is basically selected about 5 or 6 artists whose work I love, identify with, and kind of wanted to mix it up and place their works from the Goodman collection in context of not only their work in general, but also in the context of Latin American art as a whole. So, let's see. And right clicker. There we go. Oh, there we go. First artist, Joaquin Torres Garcia. Certainly one of the pioneers in not only Latin American art, but also modern European art as well. And he was the son of Spanish immigrants. He was born in Uruguay. And at the age of 17, his father, who was a general store owner in Montevideo at the port, decided to move back to Spain, to Barcelona with his family. So Torres Garcia and his siblings became Spanish citizens. And basically speaking, in order to facilitate Joaquin's art studies, he enrolled in art school in Barcelona, where at the young age of 17, actually got to know the likes of Pablo Picasso, whom he became quite friendly with over the years. And the two, along with other artists from the avant-garde circle, were responsible for bringing not only Barcelona, but Spanish art to the forefront in terms of modernism. In 1900, Torres Garcia had his first solo exhibition where he gained great notoriety, and his work was noticed by Antoni Gaudí, and commissioned Torres Garcia to actually create some stained glass windows for the Cathedral Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Here's a photograph of Torres Garcia while he was taking a break while making these stained glass windows. As his career continued to grow, Torres Garcia in 1910 was already a well-established artist in not only Spain but also in France, and he wrote a letter of introduction for a young Catalan artist named Juan Miró to meet Pablo Picasso. This sort of illustrates how important Torres Garcia was at that point in time. And what's fascinating is that after World War I, the artists the Cubists like Picasso, Braque, and Juan Leger abandoned Cubism in order for a return to order, and were embracing figurative art, and especially classicism. Mondrian and Torres Garcia and other de Stijl artists felt that the direction of art for the modern era should actually continue into abstraction and relegate figurative art to the back seat. In 1922, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here, Torres Garcia and Mondrian almost came literally to physical blows over the direction of art, because Torres Garcia ended up thinking that neoplasticism is really not the direction of art. He felt that it was highly important to continue to have symbolism or figuration in his art. Here's a wonderful work from 1930 called Tabak from the Goodman collection from 1930, and you can see how although he's still embracing figuration, there is still an element of abstraction in his art. This work from 1931, also in the Goodman collection, is called Railway Station 2 from 1931. For me, is like the golden year for Torres Garcia's art. Apparently, Cecilia de Torres last year gave a wonderful talk about Torres Garcia and the meaning of the symbols in his art. I'm not going to go into the symbolism for you today, but basically speaking, he was very much interested in the symbols that would add up to a pictorial language that was embraced by his students from the Taller Torres Garcia. What's interesting is that Torres Garcia also was very much fascinated with pre-Columbian art, especially the art from South America. Here are two examples of a Baracas culture. This is pre-Inca from Peru, a ceramic vessel on the left and a poncho on the right. Wonderful abstraction and geometry and earthy tones that were embraced not only by Torres Garcia himself, but also by the students of the Taller. Here you have two other works from the Goodman collection, Francisco Mato and Jose Gurvich. You can see how the artists are embracing the symbols that were being incorporated in Joaquin's pictorial lexicon, but adopting their own proper language. And if you look at the painting on the right, especially, Dos Cabezas, you'll see that it's really reminiscent of Sacsayhuaman in Peru. These artists, many of whom, Cesar Paternoster, Gurvich, and others, actually traveled to Peru and were able to absorb the physical embodiment of these abstract stones. These monoliths in Sacsayhuaman, for instance, weigh anywhere from 90 to 120 tons. The largest one on the left weighs 200 tons. That's 400,000 pounds. And these rocks are carved to such a degree of perfection that you cannot stick a knife blade between them. Augusto Torres, Joaquin's son, and Manuel Pailos, you can see the influence again of these monolithic sculptures or fortresses that were made in Peru. And you'll see on the left, Augusto Torres' construction in gray tones, the word sur, which is a reference to the compass and why artists who were working in the Southern Cone really refused to look north as a guide for inspiration. They thought that the compass should actually point south, to the point where Torres Garcia painted a work called El Sur with the inverted map of North and South America. And Pailos, you can see again, references to the stonework and the shadows that are cast in the high sun in those latitudes. Another artist that I've admired greatly is Gonzalo Fonseca. And again, Fonseca was very much interested in pre-Columbian art as well as just working stone. One of my favorite, I don't know if anybody here has been to Cusco, Peru, much more so Quenco, which is my favorite site in all of the Inca sites in Peru. Quenco is this giant rock which has been carved with these little tiny stairways and niches that lead nowhere. And at the bottom, or inside this giant rock, is a cave with these little altars. And this site specifically had a great deal of impact on Gonzalo Fonseca. On the right, you can see an installation shot from the retrospective which he had in 2017-18 at the Noguchi Museum in Brooklyn, New York. What's interesting is that if you look at these three works, you'll see a bit of an inspiration of the work of Isamu Noguchi himself. They were both very, very good friends. They worked at the same time in New York, and they visited each other in Italy when they were quarrying stones for their respective sculptures, and they had an extraordinary lifelong friendship. But this piece here, Stella with Sacred Stones from 1973 to 76, from the Goodman collection, I think is the embodiment of sculpture by this important artist. You'll see that, you have these, again, a niche, this doorway, and this sort of sculpted overhang, which is, again, a reference to not only Kenko, but other sites in pre-Inca cultures, but also the talisman and these carved stones, which are also found in Inca and pre-Inca burials. A wonderful work. Amelia Pelaez from Cuba. Very rare to see a woman artist who was working in Cuba during the 1920s and 30s. She basically proved her mettle. Her parents moved the family to Havana in 1924 for her to study at the National Academy at San Carlos. At San Alejandro. And basically, her success enabled her to get a government prize to work basically at the Art Students League in New York in 1927, I think. In 1934, she won again another government prize to study art in Paris, where she worked under Fernand Léger, and given her success in Paris, returned back to Cuba and divorced herself basically from European modernism. So what do I say, or why do I say that? Because she was basically adopting and celebrating elements that were endemic to Cuba. If you've been to Havana, and you walk down the streets, you see these wonderful stained glass windows that adorn doorways and windows. And if you walk inside, they cast these beautiful colors in interiors. And throughout her life, Pelaez was constantly making references to the wrought iron, the elements of the sea, the fruit, the ocean, the weather, everything having to do with the tropics, which had nothing to do with the cold modernism that was being produced in Europe at that same time. Here, a work from 1953 called Olympia is Pelaez's homage, sort of looking back to her years in Paris at Edouard Manet's 1863 painting, eponymous Olympia as well. But if you look at the left, you can still see some vague references to stained glass windows on the left. But the woman Olympia is holding a fan, sort of reflecting the tropical heat that you see in that island nation. And the woman, her attendant, is bringing to her a tray full of fruit, the abundant, verdant fruit that you find in the tropics. A wonderful work. Mario Carreño is another artist that's very well represented in the Goodman collection. And what's fascinating is that the drawing on the right, which is called Ruinas, is from 1942, and it basically is showing Carreño's angst with what was going on during World War II. His dealer was the wonderful Klaus Perls, a Jewish immigrant who set up shop in New York, and basically, as the war progressed, a lot of his American artists were off in Europe fighting fascism, or off in the Pacific fighting imperialism, Japanese imperialism. So what did he had a business that he had to keep running. So what did he do? He looked south and basically hired or contracted artists like Carreño, Lam, to work and help fill his gallery space. So, this drawing from 42 shows a woman in a ruined landscape with bones reflecting the devastation that was going on in Europe, and she's looking east toward Europe from the island from the safe haven of Cuba. What's interesting is that Carreño also traveled to Mexico in 1937, and he wanted to meet the muralists, but the artist, Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, but the artist with whom he established the greatest relationship and rapport happened to be Siqueiros. This is a painting from 1947 called Agua. And what's fascinating is that, you can see, Siqueiros taught at the New School in New York in the late 1920s, and one of his students was an artist who would have great reputation in later years, Jackson Pollock, and was very much interested in the whole concept of drip painting technique. On this picture, you can see a bit of some drip painting going on. That was very much an experimental form for the artist at that time. And what's, and more importantly, Carreño at this point in time is experimenting with Duco, or automobile paint, which was the favored medium for Siqueiros at that time. Carreño's Danza Afro-Cubana is from 1943, also painted during a time when Carreño was working with Klaus Perls in New York. And this painting is like the embodiment of Cuban national identity. What's fascinating about this work is that it's also painted in Duco, but for instance, the rope that you see here is actually collaged rope that he attached to the masonite support. And this garment was actually, again, attached cloth, which would give the work a greater three-dimensionality, which he painted on top of. You can actually sort of see the shadows, which were cast when the photograph was taken down here as well. And the reason I showed that painting is that, basically speaking, African culture plays an enormous role in Cuban national identity. Cuban dance, Cuban diet, religion, Yoruba. There's a wonderful long history which dates back to the colony period in the 18th century. Here you have a 19th century painting by Victor Patricio Landaluce, a Spanish artist who immigrated to Cuba in the 19th century and captured the spirit and pomp and circumstance of African community in Havana and the rest of the island at that point in time. And what's interesting is that, on the right, you have a current day photograph of ballet dancers from Ivory Coast and West Africa, looking very similar to the Diablitos, or the dancers from the Three King Day, who were dancing in the 19th century, a tradition which is alive and well and still being performed in Cuba, as well as West Africa, of course. And the person who I think embodies the bragging rights to owning African art is none other than Wilfredo Lam, a Cuban artist who is highly celebrated. Here we have a photograph of the artist with, admittedly, these are oceanic pieces, they're not African, but Lam did collect not only oceanic works, but more importantly, African art. And I think that his godmother was a Santeria priestess, and who practiced Santeria and introduced Lam to the Orishas and to the gods who were inhabiting the jungle that he inhabited during his time in Cuba. Here we have a 1945 work called Personnage, characters, in the Goodman collection on view upstairs. And, you'll see, when you look at this picture, you're sort of like, wow, what's going on here? But, there's a wonderful influence of the ballet mask on the right, where you can see them, populating the canvas here, obviously up here, but also, these sort of bird-like figures. And you can see the wings, which are, protruding from these figures. And in Santeria and voodoo culture, the chicken or the rooster plays a prominent role. Also in diet, arroz con pollo, but more importantly, in the Santero religion, the rooster is an animal which is sacrificed for good fortune, and that's something that weighed heavily on the artist, who wanted to basically dissociate himself, like other Cuban modernists, from what was going on in Europe, and basically own his culture and try to divorce himself from the colonialism that was being push down on his people. Here we have another wonderful photograph of Leonora Carrington, who was born into a very, established, wealthy, aristocratic family in England, whose parents were deeply Catholic and religious. And she was a very precocious child, was always getting in trouble. And much to the chagrin of her father, she enrolled in art school and was finally sort of put away off in a one-on-one teaching situation with Amédée Ozenfant in 1936. So they were trying to keep this young budding artist under control. And it wasn't until 1937 where Carrington actually saw an exhibition of Max Ernst's paintings. He wasn't present, but she saw the work and was absolutely moved and was convinced that she wanted to become part of the Surrealist movement and further convinced herself that she wanted to continue pursuing her career as an artist. In 1938, she met Ernst at a dinner party, and as they were having a raucous time, she almost spilled a beer on herself, which was caught by Max, saving her from getting her dress all wet, and they fell instantly in love. Much to the, he was 26 years her senior, and when she basically professed her love to Max, to her parents, they basically wanted to put an absolute stop to this, and before they could, get her under control, she eloped with Max to Paris in 1939. Interestingly, the fact that 1939, the Surrealist group was starting to have a schism between where the direction of the art should go, and Max Ernst, like André Breton and Mata, Gordon Onslow Ford, basically left Paris for the south of France in order to basically get a breather from the infighting that was going on there. And Leonora and Max basically set up shop in a little house in Saint-Martin-d'Ardèche, where they would basically, install sculptures and paint some of the doors and cabinets. And much to Jimmy Ernst, Max's son's chagrin, Max was just absolutely tuning out to the fact that the war clouds were brewing in Europe, and that they were starting to round up Jews throughout Western Europe, and he just did not pay attention. He was sadly arrested and sent to a concentration camp where he was spent a number of weeks. He was released and ultimately reunited with Leonora, and again was captured and was sent to an even more aggressive concentration camp, and Leonora had an absolute mental breakdown. Her parents intervened and basically were able to sequester her off to a mental institution in Madrid. And in 1939, before she was still visiting Madrid, she made a visit to the Prado and was absolutely smitten, and just like who wouldn't be, by Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. So when she was able to secure Max's release in 1940, he tried to reconcile with Leonora, but she wouldn't have anything of it. And this is a wonderful sort of nostalgic painting that he did in 1940, right after she was discharged from the insane asylum. But what's fascinating is if you'll see, Leonora's avatar is the horse, which you can see right here, and Max is the Minotaur. But this whole near-death experience also weighed heavily on the artist, and he included the skeletal figure here in the foreground. This is an absolutely magnificent painting, which was in the collection of Leonora Carrington throughout her life, despite the fact that she and Max never really reconciled their love. They met in New York in 1942, and then basically speaking, they were very friendly, but they never really continued, to consummate their relationship. But all the same, given the fact that they never did reconcile, she still held this painting in very, very high regard. When she passed away, I met Leonora in 1994, and when she passed away, her sons invited me to her house, and this painting was literally hanging over her bed. So she had it her entire life, and it was, so the two sons were like, "Well, who's going to keep the painting?" So the picture was offered for sale in the year after, in 2012. The only numeric reference I'll make tonight is that, basically speaking, the painting carried an estimate of $3 to $4 million, and it sold for close to $8 million, and was purchased by an Eastern European collector. However, so we go into 1940, while she's in Spain trying to escape. Max Ernst basically marries Peggy Guggenheim in order to facilitate getting a passport to leave the country as an American. And Leonora, whose parents were still trying to get her committed and out of the country to a mental institution in South Africa, she was heavily medicated and was at one point under the care of one of these protectresses, and was in a restaurant, used the excuse to go to the bathroom, and ran away. And she basically went to visit Renato Leduc, whom she met in 1938 in Paris, and was a diplomat representing the Mexican government in Madrid at that time. Like Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim, she married Leduc in order to secure a passport and have her escape the country and be out of her parents' tentacles, and basically move to New York that year. And in 1942, she abandons New York and moves down to Mexico City with Renato, and they have a very tumultuous relationship. He's basically very much involved with the Mexican government and the diplomatic corps, and she ultimately leaves him. But when she arrives in Mexico City in 1942, one of the first works that she paints is this extraordinarily important painting called Artes 110, or Artes 110. In the Goodman collection, which you can see. I urge you to see this painting, because when you see it in person, it's just this absolute gem of a work of art. So this self-portrait represents her flight from war-torn Europe to the New World, specifically Mexico. And you'll see, like, the avatar for England is the hedgehog, which is basically lifting up the island nation, which is in ruins, and you have like these, medieval campsites and towers that are falling down, which is like the world that she knew was no longer the same. Moving to the New World, when she was working in Paris, in Paris, and in London at that in the 1930s, she liked to sort of include furniture in her self-portraits, which would reflect the clothing that she was wearing. And in this piece, you have her avatar again, the horse, which represents her. And it's got these red threads, which are basically weaving into a dress that she wears. It's been stated that this could represent the wound that she's coming back to in the New World, and these sort of ghostly figures that are populating this skeletal remnant of a piece of furniture. This painting is dated 1944 on the reverse, and Bonnie and I were talking about this picture earlier, and we're wondering. Because scholars think that it was painted between 1942. It's in the records as 1942, but it's dated 44, and we think that there's such detail to this work of art that it was probably painted over the course of 2 years. Again, just an absolute masterpiece, and I think it's really the work of art that divorces herself from Europe and the United States and establishes herself. It's her statement of, I have arrived in Mexico and I'm ready to continue my life. And her life was continued when she met Chiqui Weiss, a photographer who worked with Robert Capa in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And here she is on her wedding day in 1946 with the Calle Gavino Circle. This is a group of artists and poets and thinkers who were very, very close and lived at the Barreda Circle together in this location. And basically speaking, you have Chiqui, Jose Horna, who was a collaborator with Carrington. He was a wonderful wood carver, and she would decorate a number of his wood sculptures. Carrington, of course, Remedios Varo, Gunther Gerso, and Benjamin Perret, who was also in the cultural circles of Mexico at that time, and Miriam Wolf, who I honestly don't know who that is, so you have to forgive me. Anyhow, Gunther Gerso was very much in the art circles that were going on in Mexico at that time. What's interesting is that Gerso was the son of a Swiss businessman who had emigrated to Mexico in the 1890s, and his mom was a German whom he had met on a business trip, and they basically set up shop in Mexico City. They had Gunther in 1915, and sadly, his father passed away of a cerebral hemorrhage, and at 6 months of age. A year later, she marries again, and his stepfather was again a German businessman, but had terrible alcohol problems, and his mom basically did not want him growing up in that environment, so she shipped him off to Switzerland, to Lugano, where he was working, or rather living, under the tutelage of his uncle Hans Wegland. And basically, he was with his very cultured uncle, who was an art collector, art historian, would have artists, Kandinsky and others, come visit him in Lugano in pre-war Switzerland. And sadly, in the 1929 stock market crash, 1930, Hans loses everything, has to sell his estate, and Hans wanted to ship Gunther off to Eastern Europe to further his studies, and Gunther did not want to have any of that. Wrote to his mother and asked her to have him come back to Mexico, which he did in 1930. In the early 1930s, Gerso was very much interested in art, but in order to make ends meet, he became a set designer and moved to Cleveland in 1930, where he worked as a set designer between 1930 and 35, came back to Mexico, and was basically employed by the major Mexican studios during the Mexican golden era of filmmaking. But it wasn't until the 1940s where he was still he called himself a Sunday painter, because he just didn't have the audience for his works of art. But I think one of the great moments in Mexico during the modern era was the birth of this mega volcano in Michoacan called Paricutin. In 1943, a Mexican peasant was tilling his cornfield when out of the ground a small hole broke open and steam started coming out. And over the course of several days, this hole basically started growing and growing, and he started charging people 5 cents to go have a look at this baby volcano. And within a year, this volcano basically grew to what you see right here. So this was an extraordinary event in geologic terms. So you had volcanologists coming all over from Europe and the United States to study this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And at the same time, you had Mexican artists who wanted to capture this incredible geologic phenomenon. Here we have two works, of which there are many, but I'm just showing you two. Dr. Atl, who's considered also one of the primogenitors of modern modernism in Mexico, and Rufino Tamayo's Paisaje de Paricutin. The Goodmans also have some wonderful works by Tamayo in their collection, which I'm not showing tonight, but all the same. You look at these two paintings, and they're direct, obvious, figurative works, which were the norm in Mexico at that time. And you have Gunther Gerso, who I think is honestly the most important abstract painter who was working in Mexico in the 20th century. So you have, from the Goodman collection, on the left, you have Panorama from 1944. You see this wonderful, absolutely desolate, destroyed landscape, which was clearly influenced by his visit to Michoacan at that time in 1943-44. And, just to illustrate that, I'm not just talking malarkey, you have this painting which he titles Paricutin from 1945. Clearly, he's still looking towards Europe for inspiration. You can see the influence of Yves Tanguy in this work. All the same, he's developing his proper style, but it's his fascination with the Mexican landscape and also with pre-Columbian cultures. Gerso loved pre-Columbian cultures, not only from Mexico, but South America. He also liked classical antiquities, was very much interested in Greek ruins, but Mexican lapidary traditions of Mexico in the 1940s, of his visits throughout Mexico in the 1940s and 50s really captured his attention. This is a contemporary photograph taken of the site of Yaxchilan in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. You can see, these layers of stone, casting these wonderful shadows, even in the thick overgrowth of the jungle, in the jungle canopy. He visited Lamna in the 1940s. Here's again, you see these wonderful, tightly cut rocks, but they cast these very sharp, thin, angular shadows. Which caught his attention. And again, Cusco. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but this is one of my favorite stops. If you ever walk in the streets of Cusco, Peru, the famous stone with 12 angles, photograph taken by the famous Peruvian photographer Martín Chambi. I don't know whether or not Gerso went to Tiwanaku. I don't know if somebody can tell me if he did or not. All the same, he did paint this site, which is in present-day Bolivia, in the Altiplano in 1946. And you can see this sort of overhead view of this archaeological site, bird's eye view, and still these sort of beginning references to these layers of stone. This photograph is in black and white simply because the whereabouts of this picture are unknown. So if you know any collectors of Gerso or people who were visiting Mexico in the 1940s, you may want to ask them whether or not this is lingering in their closet, because I've encountered many works in closets over my years. Here's a wonderful photo of Gerso and Alejandro Galindo, a Mexican filmmaker, taken in Chichen in 1953. Again, exhibiting the artist's love of archaeology and his exploration of the Mexican landscape in search of a pure lapidary tradition. Having said that, Gerso is still very much interested in the human form and the sexuality and the melting of, the celebration of the female body, as well as celebrating the Mexican stone landscape. Here from 1960, you have this wonderful picture called Torso, as well as Red Nude in 1961. You can see these sort of, vestiges, references to breasts. Here's pubic hair, representation, and again, no ifs, ands, or buts with respect to how he is referencing the female body. But as the decades go on, he starts basically simplifying, for the most part, trying not to give his artworks a reference. He just basically starts naming the paintings after the colors, which which are the primary occupants of his compositions. The reason I'm actually showing this slide is to edify my audience. You'll see this picture on the left, Naranja, Azul y Verde from 1958. Center painting is Rojo, Azul, Naranja from 1968, and on the far right, Mujer de la Jungla from 1977. Sometime during the 1960s, someone introduced Guerso to mechanical drawing instruments, which would help him draw a perfectly straight line. And the painting from 1968 is sort of like a bridge of the period from like the 1958 painting on the extreme left. It's completely hand painted, no aids whatsoever vis-a-vis how he's delineating his composition. The painting from 1968, he is employing this architectural tool, but there's still, a bit of softness to the touch of how he's, how he's applying the paint and layering the colors. Whereas on the far right, you can really see, if you were, to stand, in front of the three paintings in first person, you can see, the sort of harsh lines, that really delineate these planes that he's depicting. Anyhow, I just thought you'd find that interesting. So we have, from the Goodman collection, Gunther Guerso Cecilia from 1961, which I think is the perfect amalgamation of the female representation coupled with the pre-Columbian lapidary representation that he was searching for in the 1950s. An absolute masterpiece. Sadly, it's not on view upstairs over at the museum, but when it comes back on view, I urge you to look at that picture. Mata, our last artist for today's discussion. On the left, you see a photograph of Mata taken with Lillian Lorca de Tagle, who were dating in between 1933 and 1935. Sort of clock forward to 1975, 50 years ago, I met Lillian when my father was the cultural attaché with the U.S. Embassy in Honduras. And basically speaking, I struck a very nice friendship with her. And decades later, when I was at Sotheby's, she knocked on my door and said, "You probably don't remember me, but I worked with your father at the embassy in Honduras." And I said, "I absolutely remember you." And she said that I would like to sell some of the personal effects that I have from my time with Mata. And I never really knew, much less appreciated, Mata in 1975. And she basically opened up a large bag and produced envelopes with love letters, which had been sent to her from Mata. And what happened was in 1933, when she first met Mata, she wanted to introduce him to her parents. And her mom put out her best silver, and Mata proceeded to just embarrass himself as well as her mom by making these outrageous statements that were provocative and intended to see how her, I don't know if you've ever met Mata, but he was an extraordinarily rambunctious character, full of life, and just loved stirring the pot. And after this extraordinarily horrible meeting, her mom basically forbade her from continuing to see him. He sent the next day, for instance, a cactus with a flower saying "Beauty and the Beast," and leaving it up for interpretation, who was the beauty and who was the beast. So Mata basically was dating her secretly, and Mata's mom and his friends and her friends and everybody in the social circle were basically hiding them and keeping her mom from knowing where they were going. And finally, It was such an impressive relationship that Mata was studying art under the tutelage of a gentleman named Hernan Gazmuri, who had been working in France under Fernand Léger. And Gazmuri and Lillian basically said, you have this sort of flailing furniture business going on here. You're extraordinarily talented. You must go to Paris, which is the center of the art world. And he obliged, and he said, I will go to Paris, but I will only come back when I'm famous. So, Lillian accepted the proposal, and off he went to Paris. And he worked initially in Le Corbusier's furniture studio. Then he became an artist under the protection of André Breton. But as he's going to Paris, he hops on the boat in Santiago or Valparaiso, and he goes north, crosses the Isthmus of Panama, and he sends her this drawing of a couple engaged in a wonderfully intimate moment, along with this very passionate letter that he mails from the canal, and he finally makes it over to Paris. And this is one of the works that Lillian showed to me back in the 1990s, and as I was looking at the work, she sort of chuckled and she said, "Oh, you're a married man, you've seen this before." So basically, Mata, when he gets to Paris, works in Le Corbusier studio, but he really wants to become an artist in his own right. He's having a hard time making ends meet, and there's a fellow artist from England named Gordon Onslow Ford, who basically, because his parents cut him off, financially, they were saying, get back to Chile. We want you to work with your siblings and help keep the businesses running, and he would have none of that. So Gordon Onslow Ford basically helped him make ends meet by buying his early paintings and drawings from the late 1936 to like 1939. 1939. This wonderful work in the Goodman collection on view upstairs is called Sans Titre, Untitled. In my conversation with Gordon Onslow Ford and with Mata, every drawing had a title, every painting had a title, and sadly, exhibition checklists from that era were usually just like a one-page printed sheet that were unillustrated, and today unless there is an inscription or a title, we've lost many of these titles, many of which have double play on words or have sexual connotations, and this work in particular is, I think, emblematic from the work from the late 1930s, where Mata was very much interested in looking at the cosmos as well as looking through a microscope. So you sort of see, the birth of a star on at the top of the composition, but you also sort of see like these strands of multi-cell organisms, as well as these budding organic forms that are emerging from the ground. And you can interpret these works of art, he himself said, either at the macro level or the micro level, and they were intended to really challenge the viewer's sensibility in terms of how one interpreted his vision. So World War II comes along, and the artists in Paris, along with artists who were down in the south of France, basically had to flee Nazi German invasion of France. Some of them emigrated quickly to, they either went to Marseille in the south of France and hopped on boats and got out, or they crossed the border into Spain and Portugal and were able to finally establish themselves in New York or in Mexico. Before I continue with this, in 1938, André Breton visited Mexico, and he called Mexico City the most surreal city in the world. He met Frida Kahlo, the muralist, and was just absolutely fascinated by his visit to that wonderful country. He met Trotsky, wrote several papers basically promoting surrealism. And when he finally makes it to New York in 1939, the Pierre Matisse Gallery has an exhibition for the artists in exile in 1942. And here you see Mata, right here. I mean, I'm not going to read the names of the artists, but, well, why not? You have Mata, Osip Zadkine, Yves Tanguy, Max Ernst, Marc Chagall and Fernand Léger, André Breton, the Pope, Pierre Mondrian, Broadway Boogie Woogie, his greatest painting, one of his greatest paintings, André Masson, Amédée aux Enfants, Jacques Lipschitz, and Pavel Chelichev, and Kurt Seligman. So, these artists, when they arrived in the New York scene, derogatorily called the American painters magazine artists, because basically speaking, the artists who were working in the New York school at that time, they accused of basically copying what was going on in Parisian art circles, ergo magazine artists. This is 1948 painting, El Profeta, the Prophet, in the Goodman collection on view upstairs. So interestingly, in the mid-1940s, Mata becomes infatuated with, oh, good grief. What's his name? Commits suicide. Arshil Gorky, with Gorky's wife. Steals his wife, really upsets the whole New York school and the Parisians who are living in New York. And they basically, when they see this kind of work, where after World War II, Mata starts looking at oceanic sculpture, and he starts adopting, introducing the figure into his painting. But he's also very much interested in this post-apocalyptic possible landscape, given the nuclear era after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And basically, they used the excuse of his returning to the figure as a reason to expel him from the New York school. From the Surrealist circle. So he, packs up and leaves, and he settles in Chicago, Illinois, where he establishes his career there for several years before finally moving back to Paris. But this is, a wonderful example of the sort of robotic creature that's populating his canvases at that time. It's sort of very menacing work. And finally, you have Mata's Li misto resiste from 1957. Like the 1937 drawing, more importantly in this 1957 painting, Mata is very much interested in non-Euclidean geometry. And basically, that is, a geometry that violates Euclid's fifth postulate, the parallel postulate, which states that one parallel line can be drawn through a point, not a given line. So instead of a flat perspective, he's very much interested in the depiction of curves or exploding cubes, which defy Euclid's fifth postulate. And again, this picture from '57, I think, is the perfect embodiment of this explosion of this cubic form, which whose planes are actually levitating and confronting the viewer at breathtaking speed. So that's what the few words I could muster to describe some of my favorite paintings in the collection. Again, there are many works which we have years and years of future lectures by other scholars who would be happy to speak about works in this collection. Thank you very much for coming, and if anybody has a question, I'm happy to entertain you. Any questions? What did I have for breakfast? No? Nothing? Yes, sir.
Is there a collection across specific years?
That's a very good question. What's interesting is that, I've known of this collection for close to 30 years, And I knew it was a great collection, but you really don't appreciate the importance of this collection until you see it as a whole hanging in the setting which it's currently hanging. I'm avoiding your question. I'm trying to think. I think most of it really does center around the modern era. I don't think they have anything from like 1900, but certainly, 1920s, 30s through the war, 50s. The core of the collection is certainly represented in the modern era. Yes.
A question. Looking at what you've shown us here of these emerging trends of Latin American art in that time, where do you see Latin American art going in the future?
Ooh, that's a hell of a good question. Where do I see Latin American art going in the future? I think that Latin American art is an extraordinarily important movement which suffers under the connotation Latin American art, but you can't, some people, because if you look at what Mata was painting in 1940 versus what Mario Carreño was painting in 1940, they're two absolutely distinct visions. Yet they get coupled into the same category of Latin American art. And I think it's a marriage of convenience and also, at the end of the day, the commercial world, I know the museum world and the commercial world have this sort of love-hate relationship. But I think that if I worked at Sotheby's when there was a dedicated department called Latin American art. And I was hired to basically reopen the department after the department was closed because Christie's was basically running an unopposed department, and they were getting crushed. They had finished selling Louise Noun's famous Frida Kahlo self-portrait with loose hair for $800,000, which today is worth about $40–50 million, if not more. And people at Sotheby's were saying, well, why the heck did we close this department if Christie's were running unopposed? So I was given the good fortune of having been interviewed at the suggestion of a wonderful collector, Otto Atencio, who put my name in the ring. And at the age of 28, I was hired. Sotheby's took a huge chance on me, and we had a really good run. But in recent years, Sotheby's absorbed Latin American art to be sold in the context of modern European as well as contemporary art to a mixed degree of success. I think that Sotheby's successfully sold Distraction of Dagobert, a 1944-45 painting, for $28 million, which was a painting which I sold in 1994 for $500,000. And it was purchased ultimately by Eduardo Costantini, who's the owner of Museo de Arte Latinoamericano in Buenos Aires, but it was underbid by a Chinese bidder. And essentially, you had this extraordinary competition between, South American ultimate buyer and an Asian buyer who would not have been in the market, I would say even 5 years ago. But when you do that, you also are eliminating a vast number, like a constellation of artists who cannot participate in either the modern sales or contemporary sales simply because those two departments have quotas that they have to reach. And they've also absorbed, American paintings. So you're selling, Stuart Davis now in the context of modern European art. And the reason that Sotheby's and now Christie's have adopted this strategy is because they see that the big fish who are buying in these two sales are more focused on those two auctions, whereas the fish might slip through the cracks if it's offered in the context of a Latin American sale. I think that further, Christie's have relegated their dedicated sales to off-season moments, as well as Sotheby's. Sotheby's will have integrated their 19th century Latin American art with American art, but they sell it in January when the market really isn't. The traditional buyers of Latin American art aren't expecting to see the art being offered in that context. So again, I think that you're losing potential buyers. And Christie's, by offering Latin American art, a lot of it in the context of online sales, you're also losing the potential buyers from adding value to that pool. It's an extraordinary long-winded answer, and I don't know if it's answered your question. Yes, ma'am. Ah, Bonnie. Oh.
Okay, hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much. One of the strengths of the Goodman collection are the number of women artists.
Yes.
And they were purchasing the work before there was a great interest in Carrington and Varro and Rahon. Can you talk about this recent surge in these? It's almost like saying, move over, Frida Kahlo.
Yeah, I mean, Sotheby's is going to sell a painting, a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo from 1940-42 this coming auction season with an estimate of $40 to $60 million. And again, these were numbers which were just unheard of. And it's not just Frida or Carrington. Remedios Varo is selling now for many, many millions of dollars. And I think that these women have been largely overlooked. But it's not just women artists who are working in Latin America. Ruth Asawa is taking is being looked at more seriously now. You name Georgia O'Keeffe, now selling for tens of millions of dollars. Huge numbers of women artists who are finally getting their due, not because they're women, because they're damn good artists, and they deserve to be getting the attention that they are now getting paid. And I think that's also largely due to the fact that you have more women curators and directors who are sympathetic, as well as male directors who are answering the calls from their constituents or from their audiences to see a greater number of women being represented in exhibitions, which have been largely and sadly overlooked. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, do you know where Roberto Mata's biggest work is? Is it at LACMA?
LACMA has a huge one. They have a 1968 painting called Burn Baby Burn, which they purchased for about $1 million privately. Good God, I don't know when that was, back in the late 90s, which was a hell of a lot of money back then. That's certainly one of his largest paintings, if not the largest. But late in life, he was married to Germana Ferrari, and she had very deep pockets and was able to afford him wonderful studio space and great materials. So he was, in the very fortunate position to be a very talented artist with deep funds behind him in order to have him continue his exploration of art, which not only included painting and drawing. He was a heck of a great printmaker, sculptor, furniture maker. He was just a constant creator. He just could not stop creating. But if that's not his largest, it's certainly one of his largest pictures. Oh, thank you so much, folks.